I have long respected Dennis Prager as a conservative that has put a lot of really good information and a lot of challenging thought out into the public square. Recently, somebody pointed me to a video that he did about 8 years ago on adultery, titled "Do Not Commit Adultery." He apparently did a series on the 10 Commandments that are foundational according to the Judeo-Christian principles that our Western culture allegedly is structured on. In this video, he commits a common error that Christendom does as well, particularly in the last century due to changing definitions. And so what I want to do is I want to go through this video. Shouldn't take us terribly long, although somebody gave me a hard time after the last video where I said, quick video, and then we went 40 minutes. I really want to hit two major places in this video because I think it demonstrates that his foundation is wrong based on a wrong understanding of a definition. And then from there, the rest of the video, while it has a lot of truth, it does not follow. So let's take a look at this. We're going to go see Dennis Prager with Prager U.
There's an old joke about the seventh commandment, do not commit adultery. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and announces, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I got him down to 10. The bad news is that adultery stays. The joke is telling. The prohibition on a married person having sexual relations with anyone except his or her spouse may be, for many people, the most consistently difficult of the 10 Commandments to observe.
Now, Dennis just said the prohibition on a married person having sex with any person other than his or her spouse. That is what Dennis defined adultery as. And Christendom often makes this error, assuming that anytime any spouse has a relation with somebody other than their spouse, that it is adultery. However, we need to define our terms correctly according to Scripture. So let's take a look. What I want to do first is we're going to go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and demonstrate that current culture defines adultery as voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and someone other than that person's current spouse or partner. So this would mean either husband or wife having relations with any other person other than the person to whom they are married. Biblically, however, this is false. According to Leviticus chapter 20, starting in verse 10 and following, it says, if a man who commits adultery, see this right here, commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. So the clear definition here is that adultery is with any man, whether married or not, who has relations with another man's wife. We can continue. Verse 11, if there's a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. If there's a man who lies with his daughter-in-law, both shall surely be put to death. If they have committed incest, their blood guilt is upon them. In every circumstance, according to the biblical definition, the adultery is contingent upon the marital status of the woman, not the marital status of the man. Essentially, a married man can have relations with an unmarried woman. It's just at that point, or with covenant connected, she becomes his wife and he has more than one wife. Let's take a look at Easton's Bible Dictionary, and this actually dates back a long way, but it says specifically, adultery, the definition of adultery according to this Bible dictionary that takes an older definition, not recent definition changes. An adulterer was a man who had illicit intercourse with a married or a betrothed woman. Right here. That is exactly what the biblical definition of adultery is. And such a woman was an adulteress. intercourse between a married man and an unmarried woman was fornication. This is not adultery. Intercourse between a married man, if he's married and has relations with an unmarried woman, that's considered fornication, unless, of course, he's taking her as his wife. If we go to an article that I wrote a number of years ago, Marriage, Adultery, and Christian Error, I will put a link in the bottom here. It specifically says in the 1901 Jewish Encyclopedia that sexual intercourse of a married woman with any man other than her husband, the crime can be committed only by and with a married woman. The unlawful intercourse of a married man with an unmarried woman is not technically adultery in Jewish law. What we see if we go into other dictionaries right around the early 1900s, law dictionaries and everything else, we see a changing of the definition. Prior to that point, the definition of adultery was written according to biblical guidelines. Afterwards, it was written more according to a modern understanding that defined more legally and recognized more legally that marriage is between one man and one woman, not based on Scripture, but now based more on Greco-Roman understanding. That's spelled out for us in the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, which I have right here in that same article, and there are links in those places. It says that adultery, from the Latin adulterium, the sexual intercourse of a married person with another than the offender's husband or wife. Among the Greeks and in the earlier period of Roman law, it was not adultery unless a married woman was the offender. So again, coming out of Greco-Roman law is where we get the idea that one man, one woman. We know that we have that foundation in Numa's law. So let's continue with Mr. Prager here. And of course, his illustration is one man, one woman, and all other women or men are off limits. Now, again, men obviously should be off limits. Other women would not be. Otherwise, Jacob would be an adulterer. Abraham would be an adulterer. David would be an adulterer. And you can look at the situation with David. God said nothing when he took Abigail and Ahinoam and actually had Michal first and Maacah and the 7 wives that he had and the 10 concubines. God said nothing until he took the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and that was the point David committed adultery, because he took the wife of another man. And so while Dennis Prager here is making a case for family as foundational for society and the sanctity of marriage, he is trying to define marriage as one man, one woman, when Scripture does not define it that way, and we should not either, because we need to base our definitions on what God calls righteousness, not what legal code or Greco-Romanism or tradition call righteousness. So let's continue here with our video.
Most consistently difficult of the 10 Commandments to observe. The reasons shouldn't be hard to guess. One is the enormous power of the sex drive. It can be very hard to keep in check for the entirety of one's marriage, especially when an attractive outsider makes him or herself sexually or romantically available. Another reason is the human desire to love and be loved. For normal people, there is no more powerful emotion than love. If one falls in love with someone while married, it takes great effort not to commit adultery with that person.
Again, you notice that his definition of adultery is skewed because very clearly God allows for, and we see example after example after example in Scripture where God allows, and in cases, as with Jacob, I've discussed this in other videos, go see a number of other videos that I have on this, God creates the circumstance for Jacob to have more than one, actually have 4 women, and then calls him righteous and rewards Leah for giving her handmaid to her husband. So God's definition of a marriage is not a 1-to-1 ratio. God's definition for a marriage is a man and his woman, and a man and his woman if he has more than one woman. Each of those relationships is a separate marriage. It's a separate covenant between each of those. Just as God had a covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Jeremiah chapter 3, two separate covenantal relationships where he severed one but did not sever the other.
And if we add in the unfortunate circumstance of a loveless marriage, adultery becomes even more difficult to resist. That's why the joke with which I began is funny, because it reflects truth. Why is adultery prohibited in the Ten Commandments? Because, like the other 9, it is indispensable to forming and maintaining higher civilization. Adultery threatens the very building block of the civilization that the Ten Commandments seeks to create. That building block is the family, a married father and mother and their children.
Okay, so he identifies a family as a married man or father and mother and their 2 children. And he contends that that is the building block that is confirmed in or codified in the Ten Commandments in order to have higher civilization. And yet, we can demonstrate that in the Ten Commandments, while it says thou shalt not commit adultery, the definition of adultery shows up elsewhere in the Torah and is confirmed elsewhere in the Torah on several occasions. Also, we recognize that over and over, God regulates how the family is to be a closed loop, such that a man, if he takes another, he then is responsible for that other, and responsible for the children, and responsible for properly doling out the inheritance to those. But God's definition of a family is different than Dennis Prager's definition or modern culture's definition of a family. So where do we get the current definition of family? Well, I'm glad you asked, because if you were to go to the Western case for monogamy over polygamy, by John Witt Jr., and this is from the Cambridge Studies in Law and Christianity, you'll find that he, a fantastic scholar and a very good professor of law and family, makes it very clear that monogamy is not defensible from Scripture. What he does say is very interesting. I'll read 2 quick pieces here for you. It says, already half a millennium before the time of Jesus, ancient Greek and ancient Rome had chosen monogamy as the only valid form of marriage that could produce legitimate and heritable widows and children. 6th and 5th century BCE laws of various Greek city-states made clear that valid marriages had to be monogamous. And this norm also became commonplace in the first Roman law collection that have survived from the mid-5th century BCE. Monogamy was a quintessentially Greek institution of the ancient world, Stanford ancient historian Walter Scheidel has shown, and the Thracian Greeks and the Romans after them regarded polygamy as a barbarian custom or a mark of tyranny. And so Prager has stated, for higher civilization, and so in the back of his mind, he agrees with this idea that polygyny, as Scripture allows, would be a mark of tyranny or a barbarian custom. And yet Scripture, God lays out his family, he lays out his purpose and the trajectory of Israel, not just allowing, but in cases requiring polygyny. Just look at the levirate marriage law. There is no caveat for a married man. But one other quick quote from this. It says that Plato's student Aristotle, 384 to 331 BCE, viewed monogamous marriage as the foundation of the polis. Okay? Essentially, he viewed humans as political or communal animals, and ultimately is making the case in his argument that the family must be one-to-one And that's the only way to create heritable children, and that way you enforce or cause them to be loyal to the state and not loyal to family or tribal building. And yet God's purpose with Jacob was to build tribe, to build clan, to build tribe, to build nation. And that remains. A key component of man's ability to build wealth, to build strength, to build power blocks is taken away from him when he does not have the ability to expand his family. It removes from man the ability to build strength and power and wealth and everything else that is actually implicit in the way God structures the family in the first place. There are just limits to what the man can do. And one of those limits is he's not allowed to take a married woman. And another limit is that if he takes a woman or a second or a third, he has to be able to meet their needs. Exodus 21:10 specifically talks about food, clothing, and conjugal rights, has to be able to take care of those, and he has to act appropriately in terms of who the true firstborn is and not playing favorites or favoritism. So while I commend Dennis Prager for seeking to uphold the sanctity of marriage, he needs to check his definition on what adultery is and define it according to Scripture, which is going to be contrary to modern culture and modern jurisprudence.
Anything that threatens the family unit is prohibited in the Bible. Adultery is one example. Not honoring one's father and mother is another. And the prohibition on injecting any sexuality into the family unit, incest, is a third example. Why is the family so important? Because without it, social stability is impossible. Because without it, the passing on of society's values from generation to generation is impossible. Because commitment to a wife and children makes men more responsible and mature.
And as he has exactly said here, the commitment to wife and children, or wives and children, and social stability come with stable families. But stable families can be had in a Torah-centric window where men are challenged to rise up and be the responsible men that they need to be and take care of, to the limits of their ability, those women that are around them and the children that are provided by that. So I will not go through the rest of this video. You're certainly welcome to look it up. He's got some other pieces, parts here, but ultimately, because he misinterprets or misunderstands the definition, the biblical definition of adultery, then he errs. And so his conclusions are somewhat skewed. So I promised a shorter video, and this is it. One of the things that we need to do is we need to fight for truth in understanding definitions from Scripture. Our definitions must come from Scripture and must not be changed by culture or by other civilizations or other law or other things. The definition of adultery: a married woman having relations with a man that is not her husband. That is the biblical definition of adultery. So thank you. Like, share, subscribe. I'd love to see your comments down below if you would. And a shout out for the commenter that sent me this video. I appreciate that. And I failed to make note. I've gotten multiple videos and have a queue full here, and I apologize. I failed to make note of who sent this. So raise your hand. Thank you for it. I appreciate it. For King and Kingdom, I bid you shalom.